Hello, my name is David Bruce. So some of you may have noticed that my channel crossed a big threshold recently, and some of you also seem to have noticed these fellas. So there's an important announcement on both of those fronts coming up at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. The whole idea of 100,000 just got me thinking about numbers of notes in pieces, and I wondered whether I'd ever written a piece that had 100,000 notes. And then I also thought it would be really fun to try and work out the speed of composing, not just for my own pieces, but perhaps we can try to come up with a top 5 of composers in terms of, let's say, their notes per hour. Who is the speediest composer of all time? I mean, working out how many notes are in a piece of music, certainly in the old days, would have been really difficult. Although I did used to have a science teacher who gave us a punishment of filling in all the dots in a piece of graph paper, which I actually quite enjoyed, strangely enough. So perhaps counting notes would be a good job for me. And I guess I'm one of the last generation of composers who still started out writing by hand. So just the physical act of writing all of those notes can take a long time. And if you look at any of the works of famous composers from the past, you often find that their handwriting is truly atrocious, and was clearly based on the fact that they had a copyist who would then go and write up a neat version of the score and the parts. And for many of us who started in the pre-computer age, we probably had the worst of all worlds, because not only was the general style of music more complex, there was a lot more notes on the page, it was a lot blacker, but there was also probably not many people interested in it, so there was no money in it, and it was probably going to be something that you'd have to do all by yourself. And, you know, writing the parts out for a big orchestral piece can be literally months of work. And if you look at some of the denser scores by some of the more modernist composers, like my old teacher Harrison Birtwistle, they have trouble fitting on a page. They usually have their own specially commissioned manuscript paper to let them do it.
My friend Bill Colleran, who died unfortunately some years ago, had paper made for me, and I use a huge amount of it. Sometimes I hardly make a mark. I said it would last me to the end of my life. And it's getting near the bottom, I'm afraid.
So here's an opera, for example, by Birtwistle, and you can see it's handwritten, and it's often very dense in terms of the number of notes on the page. Even though this is a pretty large format score, the dots for each note are tiny, they're barely readable at this size. Probably one of the best examples I have is Ligoti's Atmosphere, which was clearly written on some enormous sheet of paper, and it's just so dense in some places because he's split the instruments, he split all the violins into individual lines, so you end up with this enormous page. But again, all handwritten. And you can only imagine the amount of time and work that goes into writing something like that down. And for the most part, it's really a matter of guesswork how many notes there actually are there. And yet to this day, there are many composers who do prefer writing the music out by hand rather than on the computer, even though it's obviously far quicker and far less time consuming. So this was a piece I wrote in 1990 with a really terrible title, Symphony. And it was actually the piece that helped me get into the Royal College of Music, although I think that was partly because I was ready to give it a very harsh critique at the interview. I think I remember literally discovering new composers as I was working my way through the piece. So here's probably the page where I discovered Charles Ives and had, different rhythms going against each other. And this was definitely the page where I discovered Ligeti, where you have 6s, 5s, 4s and 7s all running together in this micro-polyphony texture that Ligeti talks about. And so you can see in a page like this, just the fact of writing out notes like that is quite a lot of work, even if it's not particularly neat at this stage. This is a couple of years later, the Bacchus Studies, which is a piece, was one of the first pieces I quite enjoyed. You can see it's getting a little bit neater. And this is, I think, it's the last piece I ever wrote by hand. You can see it's getting quite neat now. I'm actually quite impressed with myself. I know this was the last one because I remember typesetting it, and when I got my first copy of one of the early editions of Sibelius, and when it came to making the parts, I managed to create the bass part and save it over the entire score. So it was 2 weeks of work to typeset, and I lost the whole thing. So I learned to make backups at that point. Actually, I tell a lie, because this one is Crosswinds, and this is the next piece I wrote after that. And I remember writing this by hand, although I don't have a copy of it. So this, you can see, is one of my first typeset pieces. And of course with that magic thing where you press extract parts and the parts are ready to go. Or not quite ready, but they're already there rather than having to write them out by hand like we used to. So with this piece I can now look and tell you how many notes there are. And that's because Sibelius, which is the notation software I use most of the time, has a plugin which will count them all for you. Just like the word count in a Word document, you can specify the number of notes, chords, rests, whatever you like, and it will count them for you. And while we're at it, I can try and work out how long the piece took me to write and come up with a notes per hour speed. So here, for example, is the piece I wrote for the 5 Composers project. It's 1 minute long, 5 instruments, and you can see that it has 2,053 notes. So that took me 3 days to write, so that's 684 notes per day, or 28.5 notes per hour. So here's the score for my fairly recent chamber piece, The Constellation of Rain. It's about 20 minutes long for 4 players, and that has 14,266 notes. That took me 4 months, or about 118 notes per day, or 4.9 notes per hour. Obviously, the more players you get involved, the larger the note count will be. So here's my recent prom commission side chaining. This is a pretty packed piece, a lot of notes. Too many notes, some might say.
Too many notes, Your Majesty.
Exactly. Very well put. Too many notes.
And that clocks in at an impressive 28,307 notes. It took 3 months, so 315 notes per day. So 13 notes per hour. So I'm hoping that one of my pieces has 100,000 or more notes. And the best candidate by far is going to be this one, my opera Nothing. So as you can see, this is a 2-act opera. It lasts around an hour and 40 minutes. For a large orchestra of about 70 players, so that's already going to get the numbers up pretty high. You can see from the score, all 2 acts here are 250 pages in total. So Act 1 has nearly 2,000 bars, and Act 2 has just over 1,000. So this piece was so big that not just the acts were in separate Sibelius files, but the first act was divided into 3 just to make it manageable. So I've had to add up each, and the total comes to 117,193 notes. So yeah, I made it. Over 100,000 notes in this piece. So 16 months, 117,000 notes, that's 243 notes per day, or 10 notes per hour. And I wrote that between 2014 and 2015. It actually took me only about 16 months to write the whole thing. So I must say overall I'm pretty amazed by how many notes I seem to write. On most pieces between 100 and 300 per day. It seems like a huge amount to me. So you see, I'm not just watching Netflix all day. But let's compare that now to some of the composers from the past. This is all fairly approximate, and it's only based on a few scores that I could find to import into Sibelius. Number 5, Gustav Holst. One of the more recent composers I was able to find a full score of was Holst's The Planets, and that has 91,909 notes. It was written between 1914 and 1916, let's call it 2 years, so that's about 127 notes per day, or 5.2 notes per hour. Number 4, Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique. This has 65,363 notes. One source I found said Berlioz took only 3 months to write the initial version of the symphony, although he subsequently revised it substantially, so let's call it 6 months or 180 days. So that's 363 notes per day, or 15 notes per hour. Number 3, Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. This has 31,499 notes, and it took just 6 weeks, so that's a pretty impressive 749 notes per day, or 31 notes per hour. Number 2, Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. Now Mozart, of course, was famously pretty fast at writing. His Jupiter Symphony has 32,822 notes. And the symphony is the last of 3 that Mozart wrote in rapid succession between June and August of 1788. Yes, that's right, 3 symphonies in 3 months. He finished Symphony number 40 on July the 25th, and this one, number 41, was finished on the 10th of August. So that seems to be a ridiculous 16 days, or 2,051 notes per day, or 85 notes per hour. Number 1, Rossini. One of the most famous speedy composers of all time was Rossini. He managed to complete an average of between 2 and 4 entire operas per year for as many as 20 years. Unfortunately, it's hard to find full scores of his operas in the right format, but I did find the Overture to The Barber of Seville, one of his most successful and popular comic operas, which musicologists believe took Rossini just 3 weeks to write. So the Overture has 15,385 notes. Now in this score, that takes up just 20 pages of a 400-page score. So let's be incredibly ungenerous and say that the whole opera has 10 times that, so 150,000 notes. That would make for, you ready? 7,142 notes per day, or 297 notes per hour. You're a very fast composer, Mr. Rossini. So as I mentioned, countdowns have been looming in the air on this channel, and here's the 2 important and related statements that I wanted to make on the subject.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I'm very grateful to all of you who have subscribed over the past year and a half. But within any community, there's always a small handful that spoils things for the rest. So to those of you who called for my eyebrows to be trimmed, who called for the source of my power to be removed, the rest of us reject this abomination, and we all sing together in one voice.
I'm not gonna cut them, 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 I'm not gonna cut them.